Hi guys, welcome or welcome back to my channel. Welcome to my January reading wrap up. January was a great reading month for me. It was the best way to start out the year. I read from a very diverse array of genres last month. I read 2 fantasy, 1 romance, 1 literary fiction, 1 horror, and 1 thriller. I had 0 flops in January, and I would even go as far as to say as I loved every single book that I read, with the exception of maybe 1 I would consider more of a like, but I still thought they were all great. I would recommend all the books that I read to you guys, so I'm very excited to talk about each and every one of them. With that, let's jump right in. The very first book that I read this year is We Used to Live Here by Marcus Clyworth. I haven't heard anyone talking about this book except for Destiny, who I got this recommendation from, and it's funny because the first and only time I've ever heard her mention it was in her 24 favorite books of 2024, but the premise just sounded so good to me, and it takes place during the winter time. It's also supposed to be adapted into a movie on Netflix starring Blake Lively, so we'll see if that happens. Nonetheless though, I was very excited to give this book a try. I did listen to this one on audio, and in it we are following this couple, Eve and Charlie. They flip homes together, and they're currently staying in this house that they're renovating and fixing up. It's a very isolated, remote setting, like I said, in the dead of winter. They're not very close to any surrounding neighbors or close to town, so at the start of the book, Eve is home alone. Charlie has gone out to town to get some things, and while Eve is there by herself, the doorbell rings, and it ends up being this family. It's a husband and a wife and their 3 children, and the husband and father is like, hey, sorry to bother you, but I actually used to live in this house. Is there any way we could come in and look around so I could show my family where I grew up? And one thing leads to another. Eve ultimately ends up letting the family come in, and very, very weird things start happening from there. I really liked this one a lot. I gave it 3.75 stars. It is considered a horror, but I thought it was a really great balance of being both psychological and very action-packed. I really enjoyed the use of the setting. It almost felt like this ominous other character in the book, and it was such a presence. It's definitely one that kept me thinking the whole time, but the action definitely made it fast-paced, and I was never bored. I was very engaged while I was reading. There was commentary on a few different subjects that I kind of wish would have gone deeper, because I felt like we never really got an impactful takeaway message. I also feel like the book kind of left us with some loose ends, and I had some questions, but I feel like that was kind of part of the book. It was trying to be a bit of a fever dream and a little bit ambiguous, and after I finished it, I actually ended up Googling different things, and I spent like an hour going down these rabbit holes on Reddit looking at all of these theories, and normally that's not my thing. Like, I want the book to give me everything that I need to know and just kind of be done with it, but I was having the best time looking at all these theories, and it made me appreciate and enjoy the book even more. So I would recommend doing that if you end up reading this and are left with questions at the end. Definitely go look up some theories, because I feel like it will make you appreciate things and kind of realize why certain things happen. This book also gets compared to a lot of other things, so because I had seen the things that it was compared to, I thought I knew where it was going, but I was pleasantly surprised that it took a different direction. So if you start reading this one and think you have things figured out, just know that it will probably take a different turn than what you might be expecting. But I definitely had a good time with it and would recommend it if you're looking for a horror thriller novel to read in the winter time. Okay guys, and then in January I finally started the ACOTAR series and read A Court of Thorns and Roses by Sarah J Maas. I feel like everyone watching this at least knows what this series is about if you've not already read it yourself, but just in case you haven't, basically in this book, the setting is this world where part of it is a fairy realm and part of it is the human realm. Our main character, Feyre, is a human. She ends up doing something unintentionally bad that gets her sent from the human world to the fairy world, and we follow the aftermath from there. I think that's all you should know going into this book. I ended up giving this one 4.25 stars. It is so funny looking back on it, because I definitely thought this was going to be like the highlight of my month. I thought it was going to be all consuming and take over my whole life. Not to say I didn't enjoy it, and not even that I thought it would be a 5-star read, but I don't know, I feel like this book kind of got overshadowed by the release of Onyx Storm, and I kind of got swept back up into the Empyrean world. So maybe I picked a bad time to try and start this series. I did want to do some kind of reading vlog with it, but I don't know, I feel like February is already looking a bit stacked too, so I don't know if I'm gonna have time to jump back into this series, although I'm very excited for book 2 because I've heard that's most people's favorite, but I did really enjoy this one. I feel like this would be a great beginner fantasy book, and I kind of wish this had been my intro to fantasy, because a lot of people say that Fourth Wing is a great introduction to fantasy. And going into Fourth Wing as someone who'd really never read fantasy, I found myself a little bit confused in parts and things were a little bit hard to comprehend, whereas this one I felt was more my speed. I definitely do get the hype though. Like, I was very invested in even the world building and the politics and things I don't necessarily love as much in a romantasy. I'm such a romance girly, but I was like paying really close attention and making sure I understood everything, flipping back to the map to get a good idea of where things were, and just really wanting to fully understand and enjoy this book. I will say how easy this was to understand kind of ended up being my critique of it by the end. I did feel like it was a little bit simple, and I wish it had been a little bit more complex and layered, but I know this is just the intro and it's going to build off of this book, so I'm excited to see where things are going to go. I do feel like this one was even more heavy on the romance than I was expecting, and I could have done with more fantasy elements and less romance, which is crazy for me to say as such a romance girly, but that's how I feel about ACOTAR. I feel like it did kind of get overshadowed by the Empyrean series in January, so I wish I maybe would have started it at a different time so I could fully enjoy it more and like give it its moment and read all the ACOTAR books back to back. But I am really excited to continue on when I do have time. Let me know below if you want to see some kind of reading vlog. I don't know how I'm going to space it out, but definitely excited when I do finally continue on with the series. And then I read Anxious People by Fredrik Backman. It is so funny to me that I finally read this book last month, because if you've been subscribed to me for a bit, you will know that this book has been on countless TBRs and I just never made the time to read it. But the 1 month it isn't on a monthly TBR, I finally pick it up. I think what was motivating me is that I found out this book actually takes place around New Year's, so I definitely wanted to read it around that time, and I'm really glad that I did. Basically, in this book we follow this group of people who are at this apartment viewing, and across the street there is a bank robbery going on. The bank robber ends up escaping, leaving the bank and running into what they think is an empty apartment, but they find out it is this apartment viewing. So they end up holding everyone at the apartment viewing hostage, and we get all of the different characters in this hostage situation's perspective. And I think for my rating on this one, I settled on a 4.25 stars. I enjoyed this one so much. I love Fredrik Backman's writing style. It's very deep and meaningful without being too serious. The way he connected different things in this book and tied things together, I just loved how it was done, because he kind of makes you feel like you're in on this inside joke, and it made me that much more invested and that much more connected to the book and to the characters. The mental health representation in this book was so good. There were so many things in this book that felt very relevant to what's going on in our society today that I really resonated with and I thought was done incredibly well. I will say there were moments where I felt like this book could have been a 5-star. It got very deep and I loved those moments, but at other times it would just be a little bit too silly, quirky, goofy for me, and those parts kind of took me out of it. It almost reminded me of like Lemony Snicket in A Series of Unfortunate Events, the way it was a little bit dark but also like so unserious at the same time. I just kind of would have preferred maybe if this one was a bit more serious in tone, and I don't know, the comedic parts didn't always hit for me. There were so many great quotes in here, so many great life lessons. I definitely took a lot out of it and I would highly recommend it. Then I did a reread of Iron Flame in preparation for the release of Onyx Storm. I can't really give anything away about the plot in here without spoiling Fourth Wing, so I'm not gonna do that, but I was really curious to see what I was gonna think of this one on a reread. I know when this book first came out it didn't get the best reception. I feel like a lot of people were very let down and disappointed by this one. I had a very unpopular opinion about this book. This is like a 6-star read for me. I thought it was even better than Fourth Wing. I just love the plot. I loved the romance. It ended up being one of my favorite books the year that I read it, so I'm really shocked by all the negative reviews that this book got, but I was curious if I would maybe feel differently on a reread. But I'm so happy to report that I loved it even more the second time around, and I feel like I've kind of noticed that other people on the reread are appreciating this one a lot more. I just feel like the plot was so well thought out, so well done. Every single chapter in this book adds something of value, whether it's an action scene to pick up the pace of the story or a little detail that gives us some knowledge about a certain situation. I just feel like this book was so well crafted, so well done. It made me even more invested in the characters and in this story. Xaden, the shadow daddy that you are, I love him so much. much as a character, one of my favorite book boyfriends of all time. I'm just truly obsessed with this book. I'm still making my way through Onyx Storm, so you will have to wait for my February wrap up to hear all my thoughts on that book. But what I've heard people saying so far about Onyx Storm kind of surprises me, because people are saying they're very confused, especially by the beginning of Onyx Storm. And I have to wonder if it's because people didn't do a reread of this book. I thought I remembered everything that I needed to know, but doing the reread made me realize so many details that I didn't pick up on the first time around. It really gave me a good refresher, so I'm so glad I reread it. I feel like I would have been confused had I not done a reread, but Onyx Storm picks up right where this book ends. So I wasn't even planning really to do a reread, and just kind of on a whim decided to, and I'm so glad that I did. Even though it's a lengthy one and it takes time to read, I feel like it's well worth it. This one is my favorite in the series so far, so it'll be interesting to see if I feel differently once I finish Onyx Storm, but I'm about 100 pages in and so far so good. And then I listened to Beautiful Ugly by Alice Feeney on audio. This is her latest release that came out in mid-January, and it was one of my most highly anticipated new releases for the year. I'm not even the biggest Alice Feeney fan ever, but this one just sounded like it was very similar to Rock, Paper, Scissors, which is my very favorite book of hers. So I was very excited to pick this one up. In it, we follow our main character, Grady, who is an author. At the start of the book, he calls his wife to give her some news, and all of a sudden while they're on the phone, his wife just stops talking and the line goes dead and his wife ends up disappearing. So some time has passed. Grady is trying to get it together, so he ends up going away to this remote Scottish island to try and get back into the swing of things, try to move forward and start writing again. Once he gets to the Scottish island though, very weird things start happening, weirdest of all being that he sees someone who looks just like his wife. I ended up giving this one 3.5 stars. It was definitely my least favorite of the month and definitely a little bit of a disappointment. I still definitely liked it, but it wasn't a love for me. Right away, I felt very connected to our main character, and I definitely cared about everything that was happening. I was really engaged in the story. Everything was very descriptive and easy to visualize. I thought it was a very atmospheric setting, and I loved reading about all the details. The first half of the book was so interesting to me because we're getting all these puzzle pieces that don't seem to fit together, and you're trying to figure out where things might go. But I will say, from the second half to the end, it definitely lost me a little bit. I feel like the book kind of lost steam and I wasn't enjoying my time quite as much. I thought I had things figured out, but the reveal ended up taking me by surprise for sure. I don't necessarily love how it went. I feel like I was still left with some questions. Overall, I did enjoy it though. It was very easy to follow along with and kept me entertained the whole time. Okay, and then I read The Wish by Nicholas Sparks, my first ever Nicholas Sparks book. I've watched plenty of his movies that have been adapted from his books, so I feel like I never really had a desire before to read from him. I feel like I kind of knew what to expect, and as much as I am a romance girly, I feel like his kind of romance is like big, grand romantic gestures and very cliche and formulaic, so I didn't necessarily think I would absolutely love his books, but I did want to give this one a try. The people who had been recommending it on Book Talk had very similar taste to me, and this one sounded a bit different from his other books. So basically, in The Wish, I picked it up in January because I'd heard it takes place around like Christmas, New Year's time, and I would recommend reading it around that time of year. We follow our main character Maggie, and we get past and present timelines of her life. In the present, Maggie is in her 30s. She's a travel photographer. She runs this art gallery where she sells her photographs, and she ends up getting a medical diagnosis that really kind of turns her world upside down. She ends up kind of confiding in a guy who works for her in the art gallery, and she is recounting a story of her most memorable Christmas back when she was 16 years old, and that's what ends up being our past timeline of the book. We see that Maggie was sent away to live with her aunt over the Christmas season and what happened during the months that she spent there. Oh my gosh, you guys. Aside from my reread of Iron Flame, which I'm not going to count since it was a reread, this is my first 5-star of the year. I'm actually going to start tearing up just thinking about how much I loved this book, and I was fully not expecting to love it as much as I did. I always love a good past and present timeline story, but something about the timelines in this book, they felt so different from one another. I think because of the growth that Maggie's character goes through, it felt like two incredible, beautiful stories in one book. I have never been more invested. The characters in this book were just so sweet and so endearing, and I was rooting for them the whole way through. Even when I thought I knew exactly where things were going with this book, book. It completely took me by surprise and it was the biggest sob fest ever. Like, I have never cried harder at a book than I have this one, but I mean that in the best way. I was so emotionally invested, so connected. I loved everything about this book, and I really hope that this is going to be one of the next books that gets adapted into a movie, because I was just picturing everything the whole time. It just felt so cinematic in the best way. Truly the most endearing, beautiful story that is going to stick with me. This will definitely be one of my favorite books of the whole year. I just loved it. It left such an impact on me. I'm never gonna forget this story or these characters. I feel like right now I could just like sit down and reread the whole entire thing. That's how much I loved it. I have been recommending this to everyone I know. Just be prepared. It is extremely sad, but I think it was well worth the tears because it was just such a good story. So many times too, it was hard to believe this was written by a man just because of the perspectives in here and some of the things that happened. I just thought Nicholas Sparks did an incredible job. I definitely want to read more from Nicholas Sparks this year, so if you have any recommendations of more of his books that you think I should pick up next, please let me know. So those were all the books that I read in January. That is going to conclude my first wrap up of 2025. I hope you guys enjoyed watching. Let me know if you've read any of the books that I read last month, what your reading month looked like in January down below in the comments. I would love to chat about books with you guys. If you liked watching, be sure to give this video a thumbs up, and if you're not already subscribed to my channel, make sure you hit the red button to stick around. I would love to have you guys here. Thank you so much for watching, and I will see you so soon in my next one. Bye guys.